Good evening once again. I'm Deepor, Director of Yardstick Educational Initiatives. On behalf of Yardstick, I would like to welcome everyone to this webinar, Assessments Amid the Pandemic. We have educators joining from across Middle East, UAE, Oman, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, then Jordan, and India. Those who do not know about Yardstick, we provide customized solutions to implement experiential learning through hands-on science math projects aligned to the curriculum standards. We also provide a comprehensive assessment platform for formative assessments. It's the second webinar in the series amid the pandemic. We have received overwhelming response to the first webinar, which was experiential learning amid the pandemic. And this one is no different. We're also live streaming through YouTube, and those who are unable to join us through Zoom will be joining us in YouTube. And I welcome you all. Moving ahead, let me introduce the speakers in the order of their presentation. Mr. Chris Green. I had the opportunity of introducing Chris quite a few times. We've been associated for a long time with Chris. He's the former education advisor to KHDA in Dubai and has led a range of leadership and improvement projects in the USA, China, and Bahrain. Prior to directing School Review in Bahrain, he was the chief executive of Education Leadership and Management Solution. He's currently the director of Gulf Education Services. Our second speaker is Dr. Sattar Mustafa Amri. Dr. Amri is a seasoned educator with over 25 years of experience. He has extensive exposure to school improvement projects in the Gulf region as a quality consultant. He served as an improvement partner in schools in Bahrain. He is currently the principal of Al Rawabi International School in Bahrain and a professional certified trainer with Canada Global Center. Our third speaker, Ms. Laura Jimenez. She's the Director of Standards and Accountability at Center for American Progress. Previously, Laura served as a Director of the College and Career Readiness and Success at the American Institute for Research. Prior to her role at AIR, Laura served as a Special Assistant in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education at the US Department of Education, where she advised on policy for key K-12 education programs and initiatives. We have 20-minute sessions from each speaker, followed by a 10-minute Q&A. For all the attendees can communicate with us through the chat and the Q&A option. Thank you once again for joining us, and happy learning. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you to Paul. Just want to say thank you for the opportunity to share an hour or so with you and colleagues and the wide number of participants from right across the world. So very grateful for the opportunity. These are always a mutual two-way learning process event. So I'm looking forward to offering what I can offer, but certainly learning a lot from the comments from the participants and from my colleagues sharing the webinar. Now, I hope you like the graphic that we've chosen for this. It's what might come to mind when you ask most people about assessment, certainly assessment in schools. These days, and certainly when we're on remote learning situations, the multiple choice option mark reader response sheet springs to mind, with the possibility of having to choose one of four options to try and get the right option to match the question that's being set. The reason we put that there really is to sort of draw people in with things which are familiar, but the point we want to make really is that this is really only a very narrow, extremely narrow concept about what assessment is all about. The subtitle there is Folly or Fortitude. I just want to make a point about folly. I mean, there's a folly in assessment, depending on whose angle you're looking at it from. I think a student in a school, maybe a 7-year-old or a 17-year-old, would have a very different view of what assessment's all about to a politician who's driving, for example, education policy. People come at these things with very different views, and that sometimes leads to a fair bit of controversy as to how much should be invested in assessment and what it actually is all about. Fortitude's there because it is a strength in our system. You can't teach very much. You can't help people learn if you have no sense of how well they're doing or what they've learned before. So it's a double-edged sword, this, and I hope that my introductory few minutes will set colleagues up to paint some of the detail that goes with it. The third I'm sorry, before we go on, the third subtitle there is the metrics imaginary. And that's because really we put an awful lot of store sometimes by test results and assessment results, when really we're seduced by the fact that there's a number on them, and we don't always think about what's behind the number. I'll give some examples of that in a few minutes, but to kick off, we're on this three-way classification. I want to use this classification to structure the next few minutes. There are three broad aspects to assessment as we see it, as Global Education Services sees it. I think probably we're in line with Yardstick as well on this. The first one is assessment for learning. Second one, assessment as learning. I think Dr. Sitar is going to call that assessment is learning, which is very appropriate from my point of view. And thirdly, assessment of learning. Now, when we look at these three aspects, we can begin to match different tests and different assessment systems to each of them. I've been through, you can see in the background here, my study is full of books and catalogues and things. When I was asked to make this contribution to the webinar, I had a quick look through some of the material I've got on assessment. It goes back to the 1980s, a lot of it, because assessment really burst into prominence in the 1980s when we got into the market-driven economy, education for profit, all those things that the neoliberal agenda brought to us in the 80s. And there are hundreds of testing devices or assessment devices available to us on the market. Now, they're not always tests. Sometimes they're graduated descriptors of performance and methods as well of actually helping benchmark students' coursework. So there's a whole range of things. We don't just want to talk about tests, but when we talk about assessment to a large number of schools, it's usually advice they're wanting about what tests to buy. Should they buy a cognitive abilities test, for example? Should they buy a test which measures general performance, IQ sometimes? Should they have a test that measures against curriculum standards, whatever those are? Should they have a test that measures progress? For example, MAP, the American, very popular American system. If you buy into that program, you can use it under one fee 3 times a year to check on progress. So there are varying degrees, assessment where there's hardly any testing to assessment where there's very regular testing. So let's just have a look at those three things: for learning, as learning, and of learning. So moving on, why is assessment so important? Well, without an understanding of where students' prior learning and knowledge is, it's very difficult to pitch new teaching, new learning for them. The current position informs the student, it informs the teacher, the parent, the mentor, any adult, any other colleague or peer who wants to help somebody else learn. You've got to know where they come from. I mean, the funny thing is that I'm talking to over 1,000 people right now. I've no idea, we have no idea whether we're getting this pitch right for you or not, because we've no grasp of your prior learning. We could be talking to people who've got PhDs and professorships in assessment theory. We could be talking to somebody who thinks assessment is really about asking 10 questions and seeing how many people get right from 10 questions. The range of people's background knowledge is huge, and therefore this kind of presentation is something we really should try and avoid when we're serious about learning. This presentation is good because it's sharing, and we're hoping we're getting it about right, but it's certainly without assessment for learning. I come from England in my background, and I will be following the black box of assessment that was put together by King's College London in the 80s. A team from there have been very high profile in the literature. Professor Paul Black and Christine Harrison, Dylan Willem, Claire Lee, and Bethany, I've forgotten her name actually, Bethany Marshall, I think it is. But the team of 5 of them have written endlessly on assessment. And I find that where they come from suits my experiences and my philosophy about things. But they put a heavy emphasis on assessment for learning because they want to actually see learning being used in classrooms and taking students forward. Dylan Willem in that same group is quite keen too. He writes quite a lot on assessment as learning. So let's move on to the next slide, if we may. Paul, thank you. Here we have 4 points about assessing remotely. And the first point really is that when we are on this kind of distance learning platform, when we're doing it in this mode, the qualitative aspects that we'd normally use to judge progress and achievement is lost very largely because of the reasons I've already explained. So I'd like you to consider really the value to students' learning of assessment tests in this regard compared to assessment dialogue. Okay, just reflect on that. How far in your own work or in your own lives do you depend on tests and test results for an individual or for a group of individuals or for a whole school compared to the dialogue that you have with people about the achievements that they're making? So remote assessment is difficult to use to identify gaps for individuals because we lose those emotional nuances that we have when we are close to people. It's quite threatening being assessed, isn't it? I mean, I wonder, how people who don't do very well in assessment feel compared to those who do well. And we have a great emphasis. We really encourage academic assessment. We don't always encourage assessment of practical skills to the same degree. I'll come on to that in a second as well. So the temptation I'm suggesting here is that it's easier to assess coverage. As a teacher, you can say, well, we've covered these aspects of the curriculum, and from general feedback at distance, it seems that the students have done quite well. But assessing coverage is not the same by any means as assessing the students' actual knowledge, understanding, skills, and attitudes that they glean and gain from real interactive learning. Okay, let's go on. What should we assess, whether it's remote or otherwise? Well, there's a great call about curriculum standards and rates of progress, and there should be for that. I mean, are we actually achieving the standards that the curriculum is generally pitched at in our different communities? And are students making progress? If they're not making progress, there's not much point in coming to school and doing what you're doing. Progress is all important. I think assessment levels is close to that, and identifying gaps in those levels in the first bullet point and the second bullet point. But the third bullet point is about progress over time. We have a great desire, especially school inspectors and politicians, or head teachers as well for that matter, school principals, in looking at progress within a lesson, within the space of 45 minutes or an hour. And I think most researchers, most people who know education, know about learning, would suggest that looking for that kind of progress in that time frame isn't really realistic. Of course, we want students to make progress in a lesson, but to start measuring it that often isn't really a particularly helpful activity. So the fourth bullet there is perhaps the most helpful, in that we need to look at progress in different aspects of learning, not just about curriculum standards, not just about progress, but we need to look at progress in and conceptual development, in subjects, in cross-curricular skills, particularly in skills, and degrees of application. that is using skills to use your academic knowledge, really. And then the degree of independence that students have in applying that knowledge, and how much they are dependent on others. We learn, first of all, by being dependent on people. Sometimes we race them to independence to check on whether they've learned, and they're still actually in a state of dependency. And it's unsettling, unnerving, and it's counterproductive to move them off that. So the point really here is that we should be using assessment as learning, involving the student in the actual learning, involving the student in the assessment as the actual learning. We often call it some item analysis when you take an item that students have not done very well in, for example, in some test or some assessment activity, and we ask them to break down why they've got it wrong, where they've got it wrong, where their gaps, where their shortfalls are. So the actual act of being involved in assessment is actually quite central to the learning. Just 3 points in this this bottom bullet point. I mean, progress can be measured in terms of progress in thinking and progress in doing. The two things go hand in hand. We need to look at progress in cognitive development. That's actually there on the screen, the conceptual developments in thinking, but the assessments that we make of children applying those things and young people applying those things is nowhere near as big in the assessment industry. We have a huge part of the industry concerned with academic assessment, the kind of multiple choice things we had on that visual. There's far less, certainly at school level, on the application of skills. We do get it coming into competency skills in vocational areas, but schools tend to be rather weak on that side of assessment, mainly because the political groups who examine schools, the inspection regimes, don't put the same amount of degree of importance on them. I mean, I'm just thinking of work I've done recently in Dubai. There's a huge interest in the Dubai national agenda for Indian schools, for example, on using asset tests. And the data crunching around children's performance in asset tests is astronomical. There are graphs everywhere you look to compare how they're doing on those tests. Now, those tests aren't really about application. They aren't about the application of skills. Now, the other two areas that are in assessment for learning really are the moderation of coursework. Can we actually moderate coursework? Can we get coursework seen by a range of people who can make sure there's some leveling? And therefore it's meaningful. It's no point in just leaving teachers individually to assess coursework because they lose the sense of where the wider population is. But there's some quite sophisticated systems for moderating and verifying the quality and the achievement levels in children's coursework. And the third area is this idea of graduated descriptors. For very young children, we have a lot of those around the world. In England, we have a thing called Development Matters. It describes the children's physical, emotional, and mental development from about 3 years of age to about 6. They can't really do pencil and paper tests like older students can. So there's a fairly sophisticated graduated descriptor, which indicates what average performance, what average development would look like. There are lots like that. To build a profile is another one for young children. But there's no reason why we can't take that kind of teacher assessment, of continuous assessment forward for older students too, as they do in Finland. Very, very few tests as such in Finland. The moderation of achievement is done much more through these methods that I've just described. And Finland actually do very well on the international tests, things like PISA and TIMSS and PIRLS. For a long time, they were top of the international league table on those tests without actually doing that kind of testing through the school program. Okay, I hope that's very clear. Let's move on to how now. How should we assess? Well, I think most educators would agree that we assess really through conversation. It's only when we get into global and systematic needs to look at trends where conversations aren't particularly helpful. If we're concerned about students making progress, the best way to assess them is through conversation, undoubtedly so. And I've made the point already about continuous assessment of their research projects, their presentations, and their general work. Standardized assessment tests relative to the school population, they really are embedded in the system, whether they're online assessments or whether they're on-site tests. We use quick check tests, we use differentiated assessment tests so that we can determine well, for diagnostic reasons, really. A differentiated assessment test is really about, it's about assessment for learning, whereas a quick check test would be a summative assessment. It would be assessment of learning. So these things fit into different parts of those three classifications, depending on how they're used. And gamified quizzes are useful because they're fun. Children like them, you get a result from them, it certainly motivates them, and they see what they don't know and what they need to deal with. I mean, the question I'm putting at the bottom there is, so in what should schools actually invest? The investment in testing devices by schools and examinations is enormous. It soaks up a huge part of the school's budgets. I think we need to look at that strategically, and I've been doing that in a number of countries, trying to get more investment into the actual learning situations and improving those, rather than spending ever more time trying to get assessment results out that justify one's existence. Let me just give you a little story, a little personal story. Little boy in Dubai last year, bright, badly behaved little boy, at 7, he was coming on 8, and he was on the fringe of being assessed as having special needs because his CAT test, his cognitive abilities test score was below 80. He'd scored 79. And he was a bit of a nuisance because he was always chirping up, moving around, and not behaving himself very well. When you looked at his work and some of the things that he was interested in doing, he actually was performing at a very high level. And we raised this with a few of his teachers. And after a second CAT test, he still didn't do very well. But a year on from that CAT test, and it shouldn't change much, a CAT test year on year, you get your CAT score, it tends to stay with you for life pretty well. It's your cognitive abilities that it's measuring. This little lad jumped from being at 79 to being at 120. He was a different child because he suddenly realized what it was all about. He was 8 and he was being given a pencil and paper, choose one of 4 options, multiple choice test. And his interest wasn't there. He didn't really understand what he was doing. And his general behavior, his immaturity at 7, 8 years of age, didn't actually set him up for that test. We could have had that boy in a special needs unit looking at him as a remedial, needing remedial work, when actually his performance across the curriculum was very high once he'd got plugged in to the right thing. Scores are very seductive. Once you've got a graph with everybody's score on it, you know, it carries a great degree of credibility in lots of people's eyes. No, look at his CAT score. He's only 79. He must have difficulty. Look at his behavior. He must have difficulty. Not the case at all. We don't get into those difficulties if we use continuous assessment and conversations with students diligently. So that's my little homily.
Sorry to interrupt, 5 minutes left.
Thank you. We'll be there. That's no problem at all. I mean, how should we report assessment results? That's the next slide. This is assessment of learning. I mean, largely, we ought to be asking who needs to know. And essentially, it's the student who needs to know. They don't need to know the score. They need to know how they've done, what they've done well, what they haven't done well, what they need to do next. Okay, there's accountability on teachers and mentors. Parents want to hold everybody to account, sometimes very unwisely because they get hold of the wrong idea of what the assessments are all about. Schools are held to account by inspection regimes on their test results. Sometimes we have inspectors in schools who have very little understanding of what's going on in classrooms, but boy, can they crunch data. You know, it's that seduction thing I was saying before. But we do need data, obviously, when it gets to systems analysis and we get to national analysis. It needs to be there. But the problem with the accountability thing is that because we have so many league tables and we have things like countries being placed in league tables by the PISA results and by the TIM results, and because we have schools being ranked in league tables, parents get to think that it's all about that ranking. So, I mean, I've been in parents' meetings where they want to know the position the child is in the class. You know, is he in the top 5? Is he in the top 10? Is he in the bottom 30? Which actually isn't helpful to anybody, that kind of accountability. We need to be using assessments to move more towards a proper understanding of differentiation and bringing that differentiated need out into the open. I'm good at some things, I'm dreadful at others. And most people are like that. But we shoot into where we are good, where we are comfortable, and we tend not to acknowledge openly those things that we aren't so good at. We live on what we are good at, not on what we're not. It makes sense in terms of human nature, but it doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of assessing children in schools. Okay, the penultimate slide is how do we use the data? Well, we should be using it to item analysis, to bridge gaps, to make cohort comparisons. Yeah, of course we do. We need to make sure that everybody in grade 8 is making similar kinds of progress if the cohorts are broadly equivalent. But mainly it's this point about differentiation. We need to be using assessment to change what we teach. There's no point in just teaching to the middle and hoping for the best for those who are very able and those who are not very able. We've got to use the assessment results to differentiate. And of course, we will use it to select students for placements. I've mentioned special needs programs, gifted and talented programs, entrance to universities, entrance to selective schools. We do need it for that as well. So it's not all about assessment for learning, it is about summative use as well. But we shouldn't be using it to rank students in classrooms. That's a disastrous use. And I keep telling inspectors all over the world, just stop aggregating assessments to place schools in league tables. Use the assessments you've got to help the schools move forward. Don't say that they are inadequate. Don't say they're good. Don't say they're outstanding. Let's get rid of that. It's an individual thing. They're cowing to the neoliberal market-driven philosophies of the 1980s. And we've got such into an entrenched groove on assessment that that's what we still do at assessment level. We ought to have grown beyond that, seeing the mess that so many parts of our education system across the world is in, and how we are very poor at dealing with the many problems that confront us decade by decade. Last but not least, one more minute I think I've got to go on this. Key questions. Let's just look at the key questions to take away and into the next parts of our webinar today. We need to be balancing assessment of, assessment for, and assessment as or is learning. We need to get a balance in that. And are these 3 dimensions actually being used to help students to learn and to make progress? Or is our efforts, are they more concerned about telling the powers that be that we are justified in what we're doing? We have to do that, of course, but I think sometimes we get that really badly out of balance. Well-being of students. Assessment tests should be enhancing their well-being. There's nothing more creative than doing an item analysis with a couple of children, a group of children, even a class of children. It makes people feel good because we're exposing what we haven't got right, but we're doing it in a confident, lifting kind of way. We're not just telling them off because they haven't got it right. And we do know that students are stressed by having tests, frequent tests. It happens in England a lot. We're always testing them. We over-test in England far too much. Do we use the test results from students to sort out the impact that different teaching techniques and different methods have? I mean, should we be doing that? I mean, should tests of students and students' results be used to reflect on methods? I mean, I think there is some justification in that, but again, it shouldn't be a cornerstone of performance appraisal, performance management, teacher appraisal, whatever name you put that by. And I'll finish with the complexity of assessment can sometimes get it reduced to a simplistic data gathering process. Measure something easy because you get a result from that. We've seen that in many testing systems across the world. We see it in individual school districts in the States. We see it in private schools in England. And we certainly have seen it in CBSE schools across India, where teachers, certainly in their own in-school assessments, not CBSE itself, but in class assessments, they go for very simple recall, factual recall tests, because the children can score high on those, and therefore their parental conversations are pretty straightforward. If they're saying to a parent, oh, your child got 95%, or your child got 97%, factual recall gives you a nice high result that you can feed on to people, but it just misleads the world. So I would try to avoid that simplistic data gathering process at all costs, but it's very common in very many communities. I appreciate your patience with me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I know 20 minutes is not really sufficient to cover such a relevant topic, concerning education. We have a question from Mr. Saheb. I think we will take up the questions at the Q&A at the end. We will quickly move on to Dr. Sattar. Right. Yeah, Dr. Sattar, yes, your screen is.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody everywhere. Let me start with a small anecdote, a question to all teachers if we have teachers, sure we have teachers today. Once you give the students their exam papers corrected with grade and feedback, obviously the first thing that the students will look at is not the feedback, it's the grade. And the second thing, I think, is not the feedback. Also, it's going to be the grade of their friends. So, in other words, what we have now is that we have an issue of perception or attitude towards assessment, and that leads me to talk about the paradigm shift that we need to do. I mean, we need to change the students, the teachers, the parents, all the stakeholders' perception of assessment, from looking at assessment as an end mark to looking at assessment as a benchmark. Let me take you back to the 20th century to focus more on the points that have been mentioned by Chris earlier. Now, during the 20th century, assessment has been perceived as a component that is independent from learning. And later on, it has become part of learning, and we started talking about assessment of learning, assessment for learning, assessment as learning. And in the 21st century, I think that assessment has become learning itself. And Chris said assessment as learning, and I would put it assessment is learning. Now, together with this, in the 21st century learning design, we have so many urgencies. Now, we proved that academic disciplines or academic subjects are not enough for students to get ready for life and career. That's why we added some more skills to develop during the lesson. So now we started developing the learning skills, the leadership skills, literacy skills, all these skills. So what happened in the classroom, the scope of assessment has been widened. Now we have a wider scope of assessment. Now we are assessing, before we used to assess knowledge acquisition, conceptual understanding. Now we have to do this plus skill development. So that's one more evidence that assessment is learning. Of course, the learning skills are communication, the 4Cs, the famous 4Cs, communication, creativity, critical thinking, and collaboration. All these skills should receive their due amount of assessment during the lesson. And we need to do assessment of these skills and how much students have developed these skills. Now, in other words, when we have assessment of cognitive assessment or knowledge acquisition, then we have assessment of conceptual understanding, and then we have assessment of learning skills. So assessment is all through. Any lesson will start with assessment, or let's say pre-assessment, when we share the learning objectives with the students and setting up their expectations. Then once the students are in the learning experience, handling the activities, then from time to time, we will do those assessment stops, or what Chris referred to as assessment for learning. Then by the end of the lesson, we come to the plenary where we assess the achievement of the learning outcomes or the learning objectives in the plenary. Again, assessment is learning. So the teacher's work, the students' work, it's all about assessing and assessing and assessing. Now, panic and stress. As long as we perceive assessment as an end mark and not a benchmark, I will explain that later on. As long as we look at it as an end mark, there will be panic and there will be stress. Looking at assessment as an end mark means that the students are going to wait for the grade, for the score. And that's why we said that the students will, I don't know, that they will look at the feedback, but it's not going to be a priority. Assessment is for the students an unpleasant experience, because either they're going to be rewarded or they're going to be punished. And of course, this is the result of perceiving assessment as an end mark. And of course, the students will be demotivated to do the assessment. Now, if we change our perception, if we achieve that paradigm shift, and we look at assessment as a learning opportunity, as it represents a benchmark or a benchmarking tool to see the level of achievement and to plan future learning, then the students will be motivated to do the assessment. So if we agree that assessment is an ongoing practice in teaching and learning process, any lesson or any learning process starts with assessment, goes through assessment and ends with assessment. If we agree that assessment serves to benchmark the level of progress and proficiency of the students in terms of knowledge, conceptual understanding, and skill development, and if we agree that assessment provides actionable rubric-based feedback, either from peers or from the teachers, then I don't think we're going to have any panic or stress. So it's all about how we perceive, how we look at assessment. Right. When we say there is no panic, no stress, it is not exactly, it's not totally there is no stress and panic. We still have some hustle. And from my experience in my school year, the only hassle that we had in the last semester was caused by logistic and technical factors. People are not used; they are not familiar with the assessment platforms, with the teaching devices, with the electronic things. A lot of technology. So and we addressed to these problems by infographics. How to videos. We provide hotlines for the parents, for the students, for technical assistance. So apart from this, we haven't experienced any panic or stress. Now, the second thing we're going to talk about, or the third thing that we're going to talk about, is adaptation to current situation. First of all, we need to know what needs to be adapted. Are we going to adapt the assessment objective? As Chris said, there are tools and administration, new tools and the new way of administration of the assessment, but the objective will remain the same. The objective of assessment is assessing students' ability to efficiently and effectively use a repertoire of knowledge and skill to negotiate a complex task. And the second objective of assessment is to provide opportunities to rehearse, to practice, to consult resources, and get feedback to refine the performance and product of the students. So students are going to be acting upon the feedback they will receive from the assessment. Now, and this is what we call authentic. Now, as long as we preserve the objectives of assessment, then our assessment will be authentic. Authenticity takes two forms. Either the students are working on real world things, this is what we call real world assessment, or they work on realistic things, and this is what we call realistic assessment. Real world assessment is based on reality. Students work on real things. Realistic, it's based on reality, but students are not going to work in reality, but they're going to work on things that mimic the real world or reality. Like, for example, case studies. Now, project-based assessment. This is let's say the magic to online assessment. This is the most reliable, from my point of view, for online assessment. as if we look at the 4 steps that the students will go through when they do or they are exposed to project-based assessment, then we will see that a lot of learning is happening, and the most importantly, students will be engaged and motivated, and the result that we will receive from project-based assessment is going to be reliable, authentic, and we can plan future learning in the light of this data. So the project-based assessment very quickly starts with a driving question. And here I would like to stress the fact that students should have a voice and choice. Let the students choose the questions that they want to work with. The second thing, once the question is decided, students are going to go through a deep inquiry process where they're going to apply their learned knowledge. They will ask and answer critical thinking questions. They will locate resources. They will validate. They will evaluate all these things. Now, once they reach the solution, the students are going to be required to do a presentation where they're going to develop their communication skill, and they will set the proof or set the evidence that their work is authentic. It is their work. It's the student who has done this work. Now, back to motivation now. We said that looking at assessment as end mark, demotivation. Looking at assessment as a benchmark, motivation. Now, if we work or if we adapt our assessment and we rely mostly on project-based learning, then we can achieve what we call the intrinsic, the project-based assessment will provide us with what we call the intrinsic motivators. When we said that the students are going to have the voice and choice, they will choose their own questions. This is autonomy, and autonomy is one of the intrinsic motivators. The second thing, when the students are doing something now, project-based assessment is based on reality. And if the students choose to do something for a purpose, like for example, a service to the community, then this is one more motivator. The other thing, in the mind of the students, they know that they are working on the project, not only to be graded, but also because it has a purpose of service to the community. And also they know that they will receive a lot of feedback that will help them improve their performance and reach that level of mastery. These are the 3 key motivators. We call them intrinsic motivators. And I think autonomy, mastery, purpose, if we provide the environment where the students will experience this, it will be more motivating to them to work. Instead of using the carrot and stick, we call them extrinsic motivators. So, I mean, at the same time, assessment is an and. We do assessment to benchmark students' performance. And at the same time, our assessments should be presented to the students in a form that makes them more motivated to do it. Now, again, talking about project-based assessment. Of course, whether it's independent, it means that the student works by himself, or it is a jigsaw where the students are going, or a group of students are going to work together. Now, unlike traditional assessment like multiple choice questions, essays, and the normal classical exams, project-based assessment engages students in complex, realistic, messy, and sometimes messy scenarios. A project-based assessment assesses the student's performance in the light of a rubric that is derived from the learning outcomes. And the rubric here is key to effective assessment. I don't imagine any assessment without a rubric. That rubric should comprise some well-defined performance criteria derived from the learning outcomes that are outlined in the curriculum. Now, the last thing, the rubric-based feedback that we will get, of course, once we receive the project, once we receive the presentation of the students, we're going to provide students with feedback that is based on the rubric that we have devised before we assign the project to the students. Now, these are some of the other effective tools that we can make use of during online assessment, added to the tools that were provided by Chris earlier. We can go for self-assessment. We can go for peer assessment. We can go for learning journals, portfolios, video presentations, and or podcasts, online discussions. The only thing that we need to be careful about is that all these assessments have to be rubric-based. Students have to be aware of the rubric, and the rubric or the performance criteria, what we call them, the PCs, that we have in that rubric should be derived from the learning outcomes outlined in the curriculum of the subject. Now, all these assessment tools, together with the project-based assessment, will provide us with valid, fair, reliable, and authentic results. And it's very important that we have performance data that can be trusted. Trusted because we're going to make use of that data for future learning design. Otherwise, assessment will be void of meaning if we don't use it to benchmark the students' actual performance and we plan the future learning for the students. So the data emerging from assessment in practices or the assessment practice is a benchmark of actual learning and a starting point for teachers and students to plan for future learning. Now, future learning and differentiation. Of course, the assessment, we said that we need to change our perception or attitude towards assessment from an end mark to a benchmark. So if it is if we adapt ourselves to this new perception and attitude, then we can use, or we have to use the data that we get from assessment to differentiate our teaching. So in other words, any assessment is void of meaning if not used to revisit content that the students still struggle with, which Chris referred to as the gap between what the students have achieved and what they need to achieve. And this gap cannot be identified unless we have a proper assessment done to the students. The second thing, we should give meaning to assessment by modifying and accommodating and differentiating the content that we are giving to the students, the process, how we teach the students, and the product, what we expect from our students. Now, this means that we're going to have a lot of variety, and it's always in the light of the assessment data that we receive, that we receive from the assessment. So what we are going to vary, what we are going to differentiate are the following four things. Number one, we can vary the teaching and learning outcomes in terms of knowledge, concept, and skills. We also, based on the assessment data that we get, we will differentiate the students' learning experiences. We're going to differentiate our activities in terms of challenge, how challenging the activity should be given to the students in the light of their performance during the assessment. The third thing that needs to be varied or differentiated are the teaching and learning strategies as per the learning styles of the students. And we will discover that once we assess the students' performance. And the fourth thing that we're going to vary and differentiate in the light of the assessment data is the students' expected product. So we need to do all these things and all these modifications just for one reason, which is to meet the students' individual needs. Now, to come up to an end, and I think I still have time, but how much time do I still have?
3 more minutes.
3 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm about there. So to close this presentation, I'd like to draw your kind attention to the fact that we know that the current pandemic is very displeasing. It is a pandemic. Everybody is under stress and panic. But I think it has introduced something good about education, is that today it has urged all of us to change our attitude towards technology and to adapt and modify the education practices. We are well trained now. We can do it. In case of endemic, epidemic, or pandemic, we can still modify our education practices to suit any context imposed by disagreeable factors in the world. Thank you very much. I'll be waiting for your questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Dr. Sattar. The questions, we will take it up during the last 10 minutes Q&A.
Okay.
Thank you so much for very practical and relevant inputs and suggestions in implementing assessments during these challenging times. Thank you, Dr. Sattar. Now over to Ms. Laura for your presentation.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Sattar, can you stop sharing your screen? Yeah, you're good to go. Yes.
Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we are in various time zones. It is currently almost 10 a.m. In the East Coast of the United States. So I'll be talking about how we can, in this current moment of the pandemic, as Dr. Sattar mentioned, we can support strong assessment policy and practice, and how we can do that moving forward. And as was mentioned, my name is Laura Jimenez. So I want to start by giving you a little bit of context for how assessment works in the United States, because Chris did mention some elements of policy, and there is a very strong framework for how assessments are used, which are impacting how states and districts are assessing their students in this current moment and moving forward, which is pretty important to mention. So the first point is that our national law requires states to adopt academic standards in reading, language arts, mathematics, and science. And that is from grades K through 12. And states must administer annual assessments aligned with those standards in reading, language arts, and math in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school. And they must assess students in grade bands for science. They must assess all students because there were practices in the 70s and in the 80s and early in the 90s where some school districts would keep some students out from assessments in order to not bring down the scores for those students that they perceived as not performing well in the assessments. So federal law requires that states must assess 95% of their students in order to get to that all. Now, that is also a measure of equity. For us, equity is incredibly important. And to get there, not only do we assess all students, but we report those results, proficiency results for all students, for various race, ethnicity groups, for low-income students, for students with disabilities, and for students who are English learners. And those must be reported every year. Now, there has been controversy related to assessment in the United States because assessment results are used for school accountability and more recently for individual teacher accountability. And what I mean when I say accountability, states must annually rate their schools, which is exactly what Chris said shouldn't be done, but we have been doing it for about 20 years. So each school gets a rating. In addition, those schools that are performing below certain targets that states set are identified for improvement. And then annually, all of these results must be reported. So proficiency results, school ratings, as well as school identification categories. Now, given that context, that is a process that happens every year, schools were canceled nationwide starting around mid-March, which is right when the annual testing window was about to happen. So the nation essentially canceled all testing, and the federal government issued waivers of those annual testing requirements because it was a very unique moment. We did not expect students to be retained indoors, where we know the pandemic is, or the COVID-19 is easily spread. So the government issued those one-time waivers. And now the question remains, how do we assess in this coming year, given everything that has happened since the pandemic started? Okay, so the challenges for assessing students this year come in a couple of categories. The first is just the issue of where students are located. There are different modes of instruction happening right now in the United States. Some students are completely virtual. Some students are in a hybrid model where it's virtual and some in person. There's also differences in amount of instruction. So some students are full day, some students are part of the day, some students are full week, some students are part of the week. So it's kind of all over the place in terms of what different instructional models are happening right now. Now that presents a very unique challenge when it comes to assessing students, because you really have to assess them appropriate for the context that they are in. And our current assessment system, our assessments for learning, our assessments as learning, and our assessments of learning make assumptions about students being in school for a full day, for a full year. They're not built to adequately, to fairly assess students in this current environment. So there's lots of work right now within school districts to think through how they can revise their assessments to better collect data given the different educational models that students are currently experiencing. So that's the challenge just with this year. However, as has been alluded by the presenters before me, we also have ongoing issues related to the quality of assessments. And what I mean when I say quality, it's not just the technical quality of, are they valid, are they reliable, are they fair? But what I also mean is that generally the assessments used in the United States aren't aligned. They're not aligned to the standards that are being taught or the curriculum that is being used in the classroom. Now, when it comes to the annual standardized assessment, those very much are aligned to the standards, but in most cases, those standardized assessments aren't aligned to the curricula. So students are being assessed annually, not on what they learned in the classroom, which I think then explains a little bit the poor results that we're seeing on our annual assessments. So the quality is an ongoing issue for us to solve. As well as the alignment of those systems related to assessments. So what we are recommending, at least here in the United States, in terms of assessment plans and strategies moving forward, we believe that the annual assessment, as imperfect as it is an important measure for equity and ensuring that students are being taught to high quality standards. So to retain some element of that equity check, we recommend that states modify their current standardized annual assessment so that it captures some high level data. Now, we understand that the assessment results from any modified annual assessment really shouldn't be used for any other purpose than just an informative, measure at the local level, because our current accountability system uses year-to-year data. It compares year-to-year data. And because the data that would be captured by any modified assessment would be so different, it's not a fair comparison. So we're saying just use this as informative purposes at the local level to help you understand which students are or are not attaining the standards. But we also believe that states especially need to support districts, localities in using high quality curricula that are aligned to the standards. There are some examples of that in the United States, and we think that districts should make every effort to adopt those curricula and implement them in schools. We also believe that states should support districts in using high quality diagnostic, formative, and interim assessments, those assessments for learning and as learning, as has been mentioned previously, because I mentioned in a previous slide that the quality of those is fairly low when it comes to most of the assessments of these types that are being used in our schools. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention is that everything that has been talked about so far, assessing of learning for learning as learning, won't get us very far unless we're addressing the basic needs of students that we know about and are addressing their basic needs. Given the pandemic, at least here in the United States, many people are out of work. People are going to food banks because they don't have means to purchase food. People are getting evicted from their homes. This is causing a lot of stress for families and for students. And unless schools know about and can very quickly address those, students will not be in a position to learn at their highest levels. So we encourage states to develop protocols for collecting data on student well-being, including their social emotional health, their engagement. There have been a number of articles in the media that have cited that upwards of 30% of students are not logging in online to their coursework. They're just kind of disappearing. As well as conditions for learning. Here in the United States, there is a big gap in terms of access to the internet, which is causing a really big challenge when, as schools transition to online, students just don't have access to either a computer or to the internet to be able to be in class. So we believe that districts need to know about this and then address the gaps. So here in the United States, I think there are 3 ways for moving forward in terms of the annual standardized assessments. And this may apply to some of you if there are any sort of national exams that are required. The requirement for that annual assessment, it could be waived. So the government could say, all right, you don't have to administer that this year. Or could say you can go ahead and modify your assessment just for this limited time, or administer your assessment as is. What the government has currently said is that third option is assess as is, which I think poses very real challenges given that we in the United States do not have a handle on the pandemic yet. So bringing people indoors for any extended period of time, I think is a public health concern. Okay, so the steps that can be taken to support local assessment, I kind of mentioned, but I think it's important to just say that there is a role that you as practitioners can play in supporting really effective assessment practice. And I'll just kind of go through that. So what you can do in terms of collecting data on the instructional mode and hours spent in each mode. Now, the value of this kind of data is to give us some insight of what instructional models are working and not working. But we can't really know that unless we know which students are enrolled in them. So which students are virtual or hybrid or in person, how many hours a day, how many days per week. Collecting that data and then disaggregating and reporting it publicly, I think gives folks like us on the panel, researchers, an insight into what students were doing this year and how effective it was. And you as practitioners and advocates can also encourage your provinces, your states, your districts to collect this data and perhaps even develop protocols for collecting this data. And build coalitions with families and community stakeholders to apply pressure to your officials and policymakers to really value this data. The next is providing districts and schools with the tools needed to review their local assessment systems. I mentioned previously, issues of quality and issues of alignment are a concern. And there are some existing tools, at least here in the United States, that are assessment audits that help local practitioners understand what is being assessed, what purpose it serves, and how useful it is. And that could be a step that is taken at the local level to really get an understanding of what kind of assessment system you have and the quality of it. The other is just like we're doing here, clarifying the purpose of each type of assessment, and then providing guidance to states, to districts, to schools on the purpose of each type of assessment, because I'm not sure that there is that clarity. And I did see the question from one of the participants about differentiating assessments for learning and assessments as learning. And I'm sure Chris and Dr. Sattar will get into that. And I think the other important thing is making very clear how the data from these assessments will be used. Will they be used for accountability purposes at the individual or school level, or will they be used just to inform teaching and learning? All right, so the next is, again, developing those protocols for districts and schools to collect data that addresses 4 dimensions that are critical to student success. And this includes the conditions for learning, social emotional needs, engagement and attendance of students, and then family engagement. And the role here, again, is encouraging districts and schools to really value and collect this data, look for and provide examples of how this is being done. There is one district that we could find that is doing this quite well, and that is Phoenix Unified School District in the state of Arizona. And I can send around a link to an article that talked about that. And then again, just building that coalition with families and community stakeholders to apply pressure to really value and collect this data. So what does this all mean? Education system leaders, teachers, and parents need a broad array of information about their students in order to begin educational recovery. While academic information is critically important to ensure that students are learning and that they continue to learn, they can't even get to learning unless their basic needs are met. And we can't meet their basic needs if we don't know what they are. So we do think that collecting the data on the conditions for learning is really critically important. Supporting districts in creating a streamlined assessment system. So using those audits and understanding what is being assessed, why, and how those data are used and useful, I think is very critical. If there are any national assessments, annual assessments that are happening, consider modifying those so that they are providing that high level check, but they aren't necessarily being used for the purposes they were used prior to this year. And once again, the plug for just meeting the student needs, because they are going to be exacerbated this year. So that's all I've got. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you so much, Laura, for sharing the way the United States is dealing with assessments, your challenges, and how you're dealing with it. So now we'll go ahead with the Q&A. So I'm not sure if you'll be able to address all the questions here, but we will try and address most of them. And if any of them are missed out, we'll try and address them through an email to all the participants. So I'll read out the questions, and whoever thinks is relevant to, whoever speaker finds it relevant can pick up and try and answer the question. So the first one is, how will you differentiate between assessment for learning and assessment as learning? Chris or Dr. Sattar, would you like to address this?
Is it me or Chris?
Yeah, I mean, open, any one of you.
Okay, Mr. Chris, you can go.
Chris, you are mute. You need to unmute, Chris.
I'm unmuted now. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, I think Laura made the point that all these 3 classifications, they're all important in different dimensions. I mean, my point would be that we spend far too much money on feeding the accountability model, and we don't spend enough time on improving the systems that Laura has just said are often not very good. It's the same in England as it is in the States, to a lesser degree, I think, but we inspect schools every 4 years here, and quite often the schools don't get better. That's an assessment of the school, but nothing happens because they haven't got the means to respond to the recommendations. In Dubai, we've had schools inspected for 9 years and they're always poor. So we know they're bad. Why go and spend the money on inspecting it again? We've wasted 9 years of investment on sending teams in to inspect them. In Bahrain, where Dr. Sitar is, it's every 3 or 4 years, I think, Dr. Sitar, you inspect schools. You get inspected every 3 years.
Yeah.
I mean, my point is that assessments need to lead to change, hence differentiation. That's the point. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're using it as a summative assessment, whether it's assessment of learning. If you're assessing and reporting and recording it, that should give an agenda for change. In the classroom, we need to know what the children are going to do next. I mean, we can have all sorts of sophisticated grids, we can have rubrics, and we all use them and they're very important, but it's getting teachers to say, I've just noted a few down whilst I was listening, getting teachers to ask simple questions. Tell me about. Tell me what you know about. Explain again what you understand by whatever it is. What can you tell me about last lesson? What can you tell me about the lesson you had last year? What can you tell me about the lesson you had when you were in the infant school? Because we don't encourage teachers to do that. They're so busy churning out the next piece of content because it's going to be curriculum related. And of course it should be. We should be teaching the curriculum. We're in a way we're getting them hassled. I mean, I think it was Dr. Sita who mentioned the word hassle. There's a lot of hassling going on for different agencies to be satisfied. And my concern really is that we should be using assessment for learning, or if you like, diagnostic assessment as or is in the learning process, and we should be learning from the outcomes, the summative things, to make changes. But we don't really do that. And I fear that whilst the new technology has shaken everybody up, we're all using online and this kind of thing, the danger is that we get more and more removed from how people actually learn. And my point is that we learn by actually being with students, and we model and we help and we support. They are dependent on us to learn. It's not about racing to how much they've learned in the last 45 minutes. The objective is too small scale at that level. Of course, you can have a plenary. I've taught for years myself, run schools myself. Of course, a plenary is a good idea to check on how people are leaving, but people are going to be leaving that lesson not having picked up everything the teacher was hoping that they would pick up, unless it's very, very finely differentiated against their need. But so much of the system stuff, so much of the policy isn't delivering what it's intended to do. It misses the mark because people don't actually have a good enough grasp of what actually goes on behind classroom doors. I think I said in a webinar a couple of weeks ago that people get promotion and they get promoted away from the classroom. They suddenly find they can hide in the vice principal's office or the principal's office or the district office or a government department or in a business. You know, it's easier to move away from the interface where learning is going on, and learning depends on assessment. You can't do anything unless you know. And it's those three dimensions, I think, that should be put to better differentiated use. I've made a meal of the answer, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. There are a couple of questions, leading to, should we teach the same amount of objectives during distance learning or hybrid learning as we used to face-to-face learning? I mean, with the hybrid learning, should we have the same learning objectives, or should we really cut down on the content that we are trying to deliver?
Okay, if you want me to go for this answer.
Yes,
yeah.
please.
I think it's not a question of quantity, it's more a question of objectives. If our teaching and learning is objective based, then it's not a question of how much material I'm going to cover. It's the question is how many objectives I'm going to cover. Of course, if we have a good scope and sequence where we distribute the objectives on the time that we have, then I don't think that is going to be a problem. And I think that we need to achieve all the objectives, all the learning objectives using the spiraling up technique of the curriculum, minimizing the number of activities, application and the consolidation and remedial things. We can keep the enrichment, for example, activities once the objective is achieved in the class. We can keep the enrichment or consolidation activities to be done at home. We can make use of the Google Classroom, so students can do any activities, any additional activities, and post them in their own portfolios. But I repeat again, it's not a question of quantity or how much material we need to cover. It's a question of objective achievement. As long as we can achieve our objective, the soonest we achieve the objective, we can move on to the next.
I would only add to that the objective has to be high quality. So it has to be part of the streamlined, aligned system, and that may need to be adjusted. You may need to have fewer objectives depending on the dosage level of instruction, but always ensuring that there is that quality associated with it. I think you
Yeah.
would want to maintain.
Yeah. I do concur with that wholly. I mean, in a way that takes it back to my point earlier about internal school tests in some places, making sure that the students all get above 95%. In those very same classrooms, we have a spread of range where, you know, they're scoring 25% up to 90%, and yet the teachers don't actually report that to the parents. So we have a parental body that is actually misinformed because of low quality objectives in the teacher's own devised test. External tests only come around usually once a year for most schools. If you're buying into MAP, okay, 3 times a year to measure progress, but then you get more often into testing and actually reflecting on what they're actually really learning. Yeah, I absolutely agree. High quality has got to be in there. And that's going to be differentiated high quality.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. The next question is on the issue of authenticity of assessment reports, particularly considering the distance learning. Parents might be involved in helping the students and even with assignments and other projects, you know, and of course, Google is a great source of information. And research projects are not really research projects many a times. It's just, you know, gather the information. Wikipedia is amazing. So how do we really evaluate these assessment reports, or what's authenticity? You know, how do we check that now at this moment? Yeah, open to all, you know, who like can pick it up.
I'll do my part. I think, first of all, if, as I told you, if the perception towards assessment is changed, if parents, students, teachers perceive assessment as a benchmarking tool to benchmark and measure the students' actual performance and actual attainment and actual achievement, then we will not have such issues. Anyway, we cannot do without this. I mean, all parents are going to help their kids if they are doing any assessment at home. But if you remember when I talked about project-based assessment, we said that project-based assessment will end up with a presentation that the students need to give. So even if the students receive help and assistance from their parents, from their peers, or whatever, from Google, then in the end, if they can communicate all the findings, then it's okay. I can't see any objection to do that. As long, because once in their presentations, the teacher is going to challenge the students with the questions that some of them have been mentioned by Chris. Can you explain that more, for example? Why do you think is the case? I mean, see, we are questioning the process, and the teacher's questions have to be focused more on the process than on the product itself. So once the student is presenting his work to me with my questions, and these questions also are rubric based. I mean, I'm asking questions because I need to clarify my assessment. I need to make my judgment as accurate as possible. And accuracy of judgment depends, and the judgment is going to be accurate as long as it is rubric based. I'm talking about the rubric, and that's it. I mean, you can know. I mean, you can challenge the students during the presentation, and I don't see any objection if they receive any assistance from their parents. Yes.
Yeah, but my contribution would be that assessment shouldn't constrain or inhibit learning. And I think when we get teachers turning around and saying, oh, well, his father helped him with this in a sort of derogatory way, I usually say, oh, that's good, isn't it? You know, as long as we aren't assessing it in a summative way, it's good that the parents have helped. We have a population of parents who are fearful of helping their children in case they get it wrong by the school's measure. I mean, what a state of affairs is that? You know, I mean, okay, there are issues in trying to be objective when you're looking at coursework assessment, but usually the normal procedures for verification and cross-moderation identify where it's not the student's own work. I mean, I'm sure people do get away with it, but on the whole, systems are sufficiently sophisticated to catch that. But we shouldn't be assessing so often that having a help from an older brother, sister, mother, or father is seen as not education. That is education. You know, we learn by showing, we learn by being. How does a baby learn to speak? by copying the parent, you know, by being with the parent? How do you form a moral compass because you look at the values and the attitudes that your parents exhibit? And we're going wrong with that so often in parts of the world because we're chasing this this market-driven, for-profit, grab-it-all agenda. You go back to the 1970s, we didn't have anything like this degree of testing before we got into the 1980s. It's come about in the last 40 years. We never had school inspection. We used to have Her Majesty's inspectors in Britain who used to go around doing good. That was their motto. We go around doing good. And now they go around and write reports and give recommendations that people can't implement. You know, it's we've lost the plot, I think, politically, when people in our positions, powerful people like ourselves, need to be raising those questions. We may have taken formalized assessment too far. Can I just make a point about the definitions that people keep throwing up on the questions? People are getting bogged down in whether it's assessment for learning and is it diagnostic or is it formative? In some ways, I mean, I've tried to introduce those three terms for simplicity. Assessment for is diagnostic and it's formative. Assessment as is also the same, but that's actually involving the student in discussing the rights and the wrongs of their work. And summative is pulling it all together at the end. We've tried to use those three terms to get away from this this maze of terminology that people get lost in. I think the three of us have actually used the terms quite consistently in that simple, although our language does pop into formative, diagnostic, summative, as well as for, as, and of.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add to that is that here in the United States, there are some testing companies that are moving into behavioral analytics, and analyzing clickstream data to better understand how students are interacting with the assessment. One way that it could be used is to sort of catch whether students are getting help, but another way that it is being used is to help identify students who may need some more intensive interventions. The data, this practice is very new, it's not widespread, but it is some innovation happening to better understand whether the results are actually reliable, whether they can also tell us something else about what the student might be experiencing.
Thank you.
Thank you. So another question connected to the same one, what determines the effectiveness of an assessment? How do you say assessment has been effective?
What is the question?
What determines the effectiveness of assessment?
Well, if you're in Dubai or the UAE, if we get in if the UAE gets in the top 15 in TIMSS next year and the top 20 in PISA, it'll be wonderful because the national assessment, the national agenda targets, priorities will have been met. But I don't think it counts for anything. You know, I think it's about helping students prepare to be fulfilled adults. That's what it's about, able to read, able to write, able to handle functional mathematics, and then go to higher levels depending on their particular attributes and skills and make a specialist contribution to whatever their contribution will be. I think we get too hung up on how the graphs fall. Difficult question.
Yeah. It is.
I think that Dr. Sattar had a great answer to this, right? And it's really about how teachers are engaging students in their learning, right? Like that's the ultimate measure of whether or not an assessment is effective. Is it moving the needle on teaching and learning?
Assessment as learning.
Right. So what would be an acceptable ratio of assessment of knowledge and skill? Which should be given more weightage?
Well,
Yeah, you go with Chris, you know?
You want me to have a go at that? Yeah, I thought the what did you call it? You called it the your four-stage, but your project-based assessment approach that you shared earlier, I thought was very helpful. You know, where you're starting off by, you begin with a question, you set up a hypothesis, then you inquire about that hypothesis, you check out the hypothesis, and then you find solutions by analyzing and synthesizing, and then you present your findings. That process, I think, includes knowledge, it includes skills, it includes attitudes, it includes teamwork, it includes independence. It certainly includes all the higher order skills, things like creativity, communication that you mentioned earlier. I think simple models, I published one many years ago. I published it in China, and it was a very similar model to what you described as project-based assessment. The idea of catching interest is the first step. You've got to get the students' interest somehow. It's going to be relevant for them. And then they find things out, they reround it, they talk, they check. And then they begin to actually answer the original question that might be in their heads, ideally, or given to them by the teacher. And then they use higher order skills. That's what we don't do in classrooms. We tend to race to getting something on the wall or something in their exercise book. We don't spend enough time helping them to chew and to actually peel off the onion layers and create, and then present and then assess the whole process. So I think that model you shared goes some way to answering that question, your project-based assessment model.
I would like to add something about this. It's not a question of ratio. You know, I mean, from the 20th century to the 21st century, we have moved from the 2D curriculum to the 3D curriculum. Before, we used to focus more on knowledge and skills, and even the skills are academic skills. Now, with the 3D or the third D or the third dimension is the conceptual understanding. Now, the learning outcomes of any lesson or any curriculum have to be classified according to the following classification. Now, we have the knowledge. By the end of the lesson, I'd like my students to be able to know this, and the understanding or the concepts, and then the skills. Now, it's not a question of ratio, because I can just base my assessment on the skill mastery. Because simply, if you cannot explain it simply, it means that you did not understand it. If you did not acquire the knowledge and you have conceptual understanding of the knowledge, and you can come up with the big idea of the whole lesson, then you can never be able to do the skill. So if you do it correctly, it means that you have the right knowledge and you have the right understanding.
The only thing I would add to this is that research is showing how important contextual and background knowledge is to attaining skills, because a lot of times skills are interdependent on other skills and knowledge. So it is incredibly important that students are taught with a very enriched curricula that addresses arts, the social sciences, history, giving that rich set of background knowledge so that they can actually access other knowledge and skills.
Absolutely.
Right, thank you. So can we compare the situation in the Middle East with the circumstances in the USA? So do we have similar problems in the Middle East and the United States? So
could you repeat that for me, please, Paul?
Yeah. So can we compare the situation in Middle East with the circumstances in the United States?
In an American curriculum school?
Yeah. I mean, as in general, nothing particular with the curriculum of the school, but in general with schooling and education, the challenges in Middle East, is it any different from the United States? A comparison on that's the question.
Well, what I think I heard throughout this presentation is that the challenge of quality and assessing students for all of the different purposes, the challenge of achieving that seems fairly universal for all of the panelists and the systems that they represent. In terms of what schooling looks like, I couldn't speak to that, but it does sound like ensuring that there is a purpose for assessment and it's connected to learning is a universal challenge.
I'd add to that, I agree, absolutely agree. And I think contextually, I've got quite a lot of experience of being in classrooms and schools across different states, most recently in New York State, but I've done a fair bit in the West as well. And I've been in quite a few American schools, in American curriculum schools in Bahrain and in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. What strikes me about the positive in the States is the way, whilst they might not be very good at doing systematic or consistent measurement, they're very good at a broad curriculum. You often see band and music going on to quite a high level in many American schools, and certainly sport, you know, the community sense of learning around the baseball team or the soccer team or the cheerleaders or the gymnasts. It's a really good atmosphere of community learning, which we don't see in American schools in the Middle East. We see a very, very strong focus on English, mathematics, science, and Arabic, of course, is required to be taught along with Islamic education as well. But the core is what's measured in the international tests, of course. So that's the cornerstone of the vision in the Middle East. Bahrain have targets in those international tables for 2030. So there's 10 years before they need to worry too much about whether they're reaching their targets there. But for the UAE, it's 2021. So you can see how it constrains the curriculum by chasing these metrics.
Right. I think we have run out of time. So I would end this webinar requesting all the speakers to share maybe one or two of key takeaways from this webinar to all participants. So if you could just share one or two key takeaways. Starting, Chris?
Well, okay. I mean, I've enjoyed the whole thing. I mean, I think it's a very difficult area to talk about because assessment does come in so many shapes and guises, and so many different people use it in different ways. And I think that's where the controversies come, you know. And certainly, I mean, I keep talking about the costs of assessment because I see huge amounts of money being spent on examinations and tests for children that are required by government, so that they've got graphs to comb over. And then we see the same results coming year after. I mean, I've been working in a school quite recently where they have had this very negative inspection report that says the same things year after year after year, but there's nowhere around any financing to help those children in that school and those teachers get better. They have to find it from their school fees. And I think that's where I'm coming from, that there's a disproportionate investment by all sorts of fund holders in education because we have to deliver on this metric seduction, as I call it.
Thank you, Chris. Dr. Sattar?
For me, I think that this pandemic situation has helped us or has to put us into a new assessment culture. And I do believe that we need to start a new assessment culture. Number one, we have to stop looking at assessment as an end mark. Yes. And look at it as more of a benchmark to assess the students' actual learning and bridge the gap and what needs to be learned, and then bridging the gap between that and that. The other thing, there are things like I saw some questions relating to integrity, and students will be helped by their parents and all these things. See, that's part of learning autonomy. Why not? I mean, what's the harm of using Google, of using Open Book, of using other resources to learn? Because what we want from the students is learning. Let them choose the source of learning, their source of learning. So this assessment culture, if we engage the students in the assessment culture, and if we engage the parents in this assessment culture and this assessment process, and everybody knows that we assess the students just to plan our learning and our teaching and learning, and if everybody is aware of that, I think that everyone is going to help us. Because if you look at the instance of students getting help from parents or from Google, whatever, as cheating, in reality, the student is not cheating the teacher, he is cheating himself, because I'm going to plan my future learning in the light of the data that I'm going to collect from the assessment. And if the students know that, they will never cheat. They will tell you, okay, I'm not good here, because he knows that you will assist him to get there. So that's the only thing. I mean, if we can take away this thing today, a new assessment culture which has been imposed by this pandemic situation, I think it's enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick.
And Ms. Laura? Yeah.
And I would say let's invest in assessment literacy. So decision makers like administrators, principals, school leaders, teachers, parents, do they know what the information says and then what to do with the information once they have it? We've got to make investments in ensuring that assessment literacy.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura, Chris, and Sattar for sharing your expertise and your experiences with all the participants. I'm sure all the attendees has benefited really from this session, and I can read that in the chat quite well. Thank you for very positive, motivating comments on the chat. I mean, as a part of our efforts, even during our previous webinar on experiential education during pandemic, we plan to put together a forum, where educators can put their questions and their concerns, suggestions, a platform to share the best practices. So we have it ready, and we will be launching it in next couple of days. So I request all the speakers also to be a part of the forum as mentors to help and address some of the concerns that the educators have. And I invite all the attendees of this webinar as well as the previous one and upcoming ones to be a part of the webinar forum, and where we can share our thoughts, because across the world we have different challenges, and if you all share and put our thoughts together, I think we can come out with a much better, wholesome solution. So thank you so much once again for attending this webinar. Looking forward to the next one is on the well-being of students amid the pandemic. It'll be in 2 weeks, and I will keep you posted on that. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, colleagues. Thank you.
And enjoy the rest of the day, rest of the evening, or who is going to sleep, good night. So
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.